Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Black Expat Experience, a podcast and live show highlighting the lived experiences of Black expats around the world. I am Kendall Tyson, your host, licensed therapist, and a fellow Black expat. And as always, today we have another great episode in store for you today. I would like to welcome our newest guest, Jeff Idigo, to the show. Hello, Jeff. How are you?
Hello, how's it going? Thank you for having me.
Well, you're welcome. Going well. Like, I had to make sure that I got your last name right because as friends, I'll never say your last name. So it's always like your first name, but I got it right?
No, you did.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Appreciate that. So, elevator pitch. Let us know who you would like the world to know that you are. How would you describe yourself?
Okay. Hello everyone. I'm Jeff Idigo. I am a fellow Black expat living in China the last going on 8 years. Work at an international school as a program coordinator, like an academic program coordinator. Like I said, 8 years in China. But even though I was born in the US, my family is of Nigerian origin and I grew up in Nigeria. I lived there till I was 12. So even though I have a blue passport, I just have the passport. I'm a Nigerian. So even though I've lived like half and half of my life outside of both, but I think that gives me quite a unique perspective of it's one thing to be from one place, it's another thing to be of origin from a place, it's another thing to literally have like lived experiences in both places, where like I've been I haven't lived in Nigeria in over 20 years, but at the same time, I didn't go to primary school in America. So there's still certain things that are not primary to me or secondary to me because I don't know what elementary school experience is like for people because I didn't experience that or whatever. So I'm married with one son who's currently driving me crazy because he refuses to sleep at night. So, but he's a bundle of joy. And what else would I say? I'm a soccer player. I have a love-hate relationship with exercise in general. Always trying to be better with food, but it's almost like them addicts where it's like they try their best, but they just always slip up every now and then. That's me. And I think that's about it. I'm from a big family, very, very big family, one of six children. An extended family is bigger than most people can imagine. So that's about it.
Well, that was a mouthful. So I appreciate giving us the rundown and who you are. So just self-disclosure, everybody, we work together and we've become friends. I love his wife. She's amazing, Swindy. And their cute little boy, Demi. So I am very grateful to have you on the show today. And one of the things that I'm glad you brought it up was, I would say, the dual experience of immigrating into a country and being an expat. I'm sure it has to be interesting. So I'd like to know, like, when you think about some of your most formative memories, experiences in Nigeria, like what can you recall? Like what comes to mind?
Okay, well, so like I said, even though I was born in the US, because my dad worked at the United Nations in the 80s, so I was born in the US, but
got it wrong.
His contract finished and we moved back to Nigeria when I was like a year old. So I have zero memories of being in the US, even though I could be president since I was born there. But I mean, after this interview,
nobody gonna be bragging about your birth certificate.
Exactly. I was born in Inglewood Hospital, New Jersey, for those who want to double check when they start fact checking in like 20 years or whatever. So then living in Nigeria, some of the earliest memories were just, and I'm number 4 on the line of 6. So I've always had siblings around, younger and older. So earliest memories are just playing around with my brothers and sisters. Like I said, we have a large extended family. So my dad's the cousins he was closest to, their kids became like our other brothers and sisters and things like that. So always having a lot of people around the house playing around, getting in a lot of trouble. I was quite the rambunctious child, to say the least. So those some of the earliest memories. School wise, I wasn't the biggest fan of school because we had that, like, you need to sit and listen to the teacher and pay attention, and that wasn't me. I needed to jump around. Had a boatload of energy. So I used to get in trouble at school, but it wasn't ever anything like, I wasn't a little like devil child. I was just a
Yeah.
little mischievous, fooling around and things like that. So that's some of the earliest memories. And then I guess one of the big differences, like when we moved back, in my case, moved back to the US when I was 12. And it's one of those things, like, because of American media is so prominent, you always have this perception of America. Almost
Yeah.
anyone anywhere in the world has some sort of perception. And then it's like I finally get a chance to see what this country that I've been seeing in movies and TV shows are like. It was interesting because in one end, you could see why America has such a good reputation. But on the other side, you're like, it's really not that impressive, whether it's from just the infrastructure of the country. Like, I don't know, I guess in my head, I thought I'd see like flying cars or something. I don't know. I just thought like, oh my God, I'm finally going there. It's going to be this amazing thing.
Yeah.
And it was just like, y'all just have nicer looking cars on average on the roads and more up-to-date buildings. And then I'm 12, and as you get a little older, you realize, okay, you have nice looking cars because most people in America don't own their cars. They're financed and leased. Oh, that makes sense. When in other countries, every car you see, people own the car. So I was like, okay, so it's really not as impressive as I originally thought it was.
Right.
And then as you start to live in the US, and again, in Nigeria, for those who don't know, it's in West Africa. It's the biggest Black country in the world. So everybody's Black. So I never thought of myself as a Black person, literally, till I came to the US. And one
Wow.
of the interesting things is being an American, your race is such a big part of your identity. And people sometimes, I find Black Americans think that's like a good thing. It can be, but I also think it's a very limiting thing because your whole existence is based on the color of your skin, when it's like there's so much more to people
Right.
than that. And in Nigeria, that was almost never the case. I mean, colorism exists in a lot of parts of the world, but even within colorism, it's like, okay, we all know we're Black. And it was just never a thought. And, you'd watch a couple of movies when you were a kid, maybe you probably shouldn't have watched, like when you're like 9 years old, like Boys in the Hood or something like that. And you'd see some of those themes, but it never quite hit home because we didn't have that context. So I just always found that very interesting when I moved to the US, where it's like almost everything is about race. And then when they try to act like it's not, it's like, but it really is, because just like Kendall and I talk, like at our school, oh, it's not about race, but I'm the only Black male, she's the only Black female. So it's like,
Is it
y'all
not?
can find more than two people. Like,
We are here, like, and
like,
very qualified.
it's like, give me a break, You know what I'm saying? Just so little things like that. But yeah, so that could be long-winded as well. So some of those earliest memories were just being around my family and cousins and getting in trouble at school. Not like trouble, just like, you don't go out to play when everyone goes to play because you were talking or whatever, and trying to keep up like academically with my sisters. I have two sisters. They're both immediate seniors to me, and they were like academic whizzes, and I was not on that level because I didn't prioritize it. I wanted to play video games and watch cartoons, so trying to keep up with them with that, playing with my cousins and brothers and sisters, and getting a little bit of trouble here and there.
Yeah, I mean, the quintessential teenage young man, I would imagine, is what you're describing.
Yeah.
Like, you really said a lot in what you just offered. Let's just talk about like the salience of race, like the importance of race in everything. And I really wish that, what I've noticed, I'm from Texas, and the part of Texas that I'm from is Trump country right now, at least right now. I'm from like an hour north of Houston, a small town called Huntsville, which is pretty racially homogenous, equitable. I'll say, well, equitable, like as far as Black, Hispanic, white, but the power structure is definitely not reflective of that, right? And just growing up being in a place structured that way, you know, an intelligent young woman in classes and more advanced classes, and I'm only one of out of what 25, let's just say 25 kids, and maybe 3 of us in there, and we're good friends to this day. But it's like that throughout my formative years, and everything had an element of race. So it's very difficult to extrapolate my experience from being a Black woman or a young Black girl in a class being mistreated by my Spanish teacher. I'm not even going to say her name. And then coming from, I don't want to give her no fame, and then, the contrast of coming from a community where everyone looks like you. And so there's not that fear or that barrier. A former friend of mine from Chicago, hella Black, right? City, south side of Chicago. And one day she said to me, I just wonder why you always add race to stuff. And I'm just like, what? No, I don't. Well, you always talk about being Black this and a Black that. And when people ask, I'm always like, well, was she white or Black? Because that matters. And when it comes to my experience, like when people are like American, I'm always like, well, are they white or Black? Because the experience is not the same. And I wonder how, is it more calming? Does it feel, what's the difference? I don't understand. I really want to understand the difference of not having to be concerned about race, because that's the baseline. Like, we all Black, so that's not something that we are concerned about. And are there other things that kind of rise to the surface? What would you say?
Yeah, I think one of the things, and I've said that interestingly because I think, and I'm trying not to jump around too much. I'm trying to stay focused. Sorry, my chair keeps dropping.
All right.
Like in America, like race is just because that's just how the country was based. You had the natives who'd been here for centuries, white folk came, 1619, 1620, Black folk came. So it's like these 3 different groups of people that, for all intents and purposes, have never interacted with each other for thousands of years. Now you're all mishmashed together with a crazy power structure at play. So it's just like, it's part of the fabric of America. And when people try to act like, oh, race doesn't matter or count, are we allowed to curse in this show? I don't know.
Yeah,
yeah,
this
that's just bullshit when people say that. Yeah, like that's just bullshit. It's like, how can you say race doesn't matter? Now, should people always use race? And my thing is, I don't like it when people start to use race, like especially Black and brown people, to hold themselves back. Like, oh, Black people don't do this, Black people don't do that. Maybe Black people in America don't do that. But you go to other parts of the world, like I've always said, in Nigeria, for better or for worse, the richest man, the poorest man, and everybody in the middle, they're all Black.
Right.
You don't say, oh, these fields are only for Black people or these fields are for white people, because any field which exists, there are Black people in that field.
Yeah.
However, in these countries, it's not like, oh, it's harmonious and everyone gets along. Like, that's not true either. We have different ethnic groups in Nigeria, and people think, and I've also noticed, like, coming from America, looking at a Nigeria or Kenya or different parts of Africa, there's this just misconstrued understanding of what it's like, because they try to like correlate it to what things are like in America, and they don't realize how different it is.
Right.
Like, their ethnic groups, some people may know, like especially with the increase in like Afrobeat, people are somewhat familiar with some of these Afrobeat artists, but they don't realize like they're not all from the same part of the country. Right. So even though they're in the same country, they're very culturally different.
Yeah.
So essentially, the issues and drama you have in a country like Nigeria is ethnic tension. Like, even though I'm Nigerian, I'm Igbo. Okay, so those who know, like Wizkid, Davido, they're Yoruba, and they're from the West. I'm from the East. Two completely different cultures, two completely different languages, different foods, different customs, and quite often they will clash. So now people are trying to say, okay, like a one Nigeria kind of mentality and mindset, but it's really hard to change the fact that, like, prior to white people coming, my people never saw them, their people never saw me, my people didn't know them, their people didn't know me. There's this massive river that separates those two parts of the country. So for all intents and purposes, And it's the same thing if you go to like Kenya, you go to like Ivory Coast, so on and so forth. So essentially what you have in different parts of Africa are these essentially different countries being clumped together.
Right.
Europe is like a perfect example. France, Germany, Italy, Spain, they're all Europeans, but they have these different countries. But the difference is, at least within the country, there's not that much difference. Spain is a good example because of the Catalans by Barcelona are quite different, and they want to like own independence and blah, 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 blah. But then imagine that, but not one or two or three, like 50, 200. So there could be a lot of differences. And then some of the positives is like, okay, like English becomes the mainstream language. So that could be a bit of a unifier. But then people in their homes who speak their native language, and then sometimes it's like I could talk shit about you because you don't understand Igbo. You could talk shit about me because I don't understand Yoruba, and back and forth. So some of those things you can't do without. And going back to your friend in Chicago that said, why do you always put race in front of things? I've heard people say, like, I grew up in a community in America that was like all Black. And I've always found that interesting because I'm like, okay, your neighborhood or your town was all Black or whatever, but your country isn't. And your neighborhood town is not in isolation, like from your country. And I've just always thought that experience for African Americans is really, really interesting because it's like you live in a country that you're clearly not from. You were brought here clearly against your own will. Then you're the minority in that country, still living with the people who oppressed you. And I've tried to think, I was a history major in college. It's like, have there been any other group of people that have had all those layers as part of the experience? And I can't think of any. Because slaves in like the Caribbean, at least now they're the majority in the country. In a country like the Blacks in South Africa, you're the majority, one, two, you're in your native country. African Americans are not in their native country. They're not the majority, and they're still living with the oppressor. So that just has to,
it's a lot.
It has to have some kind of effect on a person's psyche.
It does.
Where if the person's always looking at things through race, how else would they look at it? Like, right. What else do you expect the person to do?
Right. And it's not like it's something that we brought upon ourselves, right? It is, I mean, you're a history major, a system of centuries of intentional redlining. I'm about to start reading this book called The Color of Law. And they got the 1619 Project on Hulu. So I've listened to everything, read everything. I'm about to actually watch the documentary on Hulu. But just the intentionality of keeping us in our place. And one of the things I like to focus on is with all of the barriers, all of the trauma that community-wise, we still haven't been able to collectively work through. I would imagine even individually work through, we still have a way of rising and surpassing, or at least some of us. We definitely have our own issues. But I've always wanted, like I have lots of friends in Houston that are Nigerian American. Houston is a hub for Nigerian Americans. And I've always been curious about like the dual understanding and how that impacts like relationships with other Black people in America. Because it's just different, right? I don't know. Well, I can't speak to it because I'm born and bred Texas, and have now having the opportunity to live abroad and to see what being a Black person in another country looks and feels like. And some days it's very much the same, but most days it's very different. So I'm curious, like, just with all the things that you've experienced, the learning that you've amassed as a Nigerian American, is that how you would identify yourself?
That's the other thing is that's how people identify me.
Right.
But because I think like Nigerian American is like Italian American. It's like means American of Italian descent. And if I'm classified as like American of Nigerian descent, that almost implies I'm born and raised in America. I just have Nigerian origin.
Yeah.
But I wasn't born and raised in America.
Yeah.
So how am I identified? I don't know. That's the long story short. Okay. But I'm classified. People look at it as, oh, you're Nigerian American. So I'm like, yeah, I guess that's what you could say. Especially because I lived in New York, like from grade 7 through college and post-college, I was in America. So I guess that would be the classification.
Yeah.
But
Well,
the point is it doesn't tell the full story, but it is what it
exactly,
is.
exactly. My whole thing is identify how you choose, right? I want to follow other people's lead, right? As opposed to what's easiest as far as my understanding goes. These are just really interesting conversations, especially when we talk about expats and immigrating and choosing to live outside of our home countries and things of that nature. I always find it like what is home, right? I would imagine even for like your little boy, what would home be considered when he gets old enough to know what home is? Because I imagine y'all going to be abroad a while or whatever your plan is. It's how to have these conversations of, who am I? How does my culture or the multiple cultures that you exist within influence your understanding of the world and relationships that you have with people? So share with me when you think about one of your most memorable experiences of coming back to the United States. So that would be immigrating. Yeah, immigrant. Well, no, because you're born in the United States. So this is where it gets
That's
tricky.
why it's complicated.
Like
Exactly. Exactly.
it's interesting. I would say returning to the place where you were born. Does that make sense?
That's the funny thing. Is like I was returning to the place I was born, but I left there when I was a year old.
Right.
So it's like it's funny when I was like 14. So I've been in America like 2 years, and I'll say I'm Nigerian. And one of my really good friends was like, "Man, you're not Nigerian. You were born here." And I'm like, technically, he's right, but like a lot of our students, can they call themselves American or Canadian when they left at like 6 months?
I
I
mean,
guess, but
and
no,
borders and
they have no.
passports.
Yeah, exactly. They have no context for it. So,
Right.
but yeah, so like when what I think of myself as, I think of myself as a Nigerian at the same time. So like it's almost like Nigerian then slash Nigerian American because at the same time, because I haven't lived in Nigeria since I was 12, and a few times I've been back to Nigeria since then, that like full adolescent college life experiences I didn't have there also makes me different now from like a quote unquote typical Nigerian. But then
Yeah.
it also makes me different from a typical American and even a typical American who has origin from somewhere else.
Right.
So I know my cousins and I who also moved to the US as well around that age and my siblings, we've talked about how we're like, it's almost like a lost, it's like we're stuck in the middle. We're not Nigerian enough to be Nigerian. We're not American enough to be American. And we're just kind of somewhere in the middle or whatever. But then when you look at some of these like expat kids that were around, you kind of see that as well.
Yeah.
But it was one of the first times I've been around people where I'm like, I kind of understand the experiences because certain things I would say to like my friends in the US, they just don't get because they've lived in America their whole lives. And then you talk to someone in Nigeria, certain things they don't get because they've been in Nigeria their whole lives. But
Yeah.
back to your question of my earliest memory, it's actually really funny. It was literally the day I was picked up from the airport when I got back to the US. And I got good memory. That was August 7th of 99. And in my life growing up in Nigeria through the 90s, this sounds so funny. Like now we think about it. I'd never seen, because in Nigeria, it's still relatively very traditional society, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'd never seen a woman smoke ever, like in person.
Yeah.
We're at the airport. This is pre 9/11. So, if your car is at the front of the airport, they didn't really fuss too much. We're at the airport. My mom picks us up because she'd moved to the US. Then the kids slowly made their way over. And there's this like white lady sitting there smoking. And I was just staring at her like, holy shit, she's smoking. My sister's like, stop staring. And I'm like, she's
Rude.
smoking. Like, it's kind of like she shouldn't be doing that because I'd never
Right.
seen that in person. I only saw it in like movies and TV shows. So that was one of my first memories was just like, women smoke here. Like they actually do. It's not just something that they do in movies for like
Yeah.
dramatic effect. So that would be like one of the first memories. And I'm thinking back to like that day I came, those first few days, jet lag was a pain in the ass. Like my brain couldn't understand how I left at like noon, was in the plane for like 9 hours, got out the plane and it was 1 p.m. I was just like, what is going on? Like, how does that make sense?
Exactly.
So that was another one. And another thing that really got me was, this is, mind you, when I was young, like the vast amount of waste that happens in America, like with food and things like that. Like people buy something, take a bite, or they buy something, they don't eat it all. They put it in the fridge, they wake up the next day. Yeah, I don't feel like eating this anymore. They just toss it and no one blinks an eye. And I'm just like, yeah, I'm just gonna waste all this food. Then I just started to realize that when I got to school, because I came in the summer, when I got to school, when I saw like how the cafeteria would work, I was like, I guess they just don't seem to prioritize not wasting food here. And
Mm,
it seemed like collectively, and we didn't live in like some wealthy town. I'm like, whether you're white, black, poor, or rich, people just waste food here. I was
yeah.
like, I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah.
So,
It just had to
um,
be a lot to contend with because listening to you now, it sounds like so much confusion. Having to, it sounds as if like what you said previously about not being Nigerian enough and then not being American enough is all of these different cultures, but then a subculture within a culture. Like there's a kind of like what we call, well, yeah, I would say third cultural or cross cultural existence that is still different than another individual's cultural understanding. And
mhm.
I'm really curious about when you find yourself kind of like overwhelmed with just trying to figure things out and make sense of the different worlds and your own perspective and worldview. Like, how do you manage that? And does that even still happen to you now? Because now we're in China and on the outskirts of everything happening back home and the US, Nigeria. It just sounds like a lot.
I mean, it is, but one, you get used to it. I think that's first and foremost. I think sometimes people underestimate how resilient the human mind and brain and all emotions, how it can be. That's one. But two, I think about it in the sense of, we all have that to an extent. It's just someone like me, it's just in different layers. For example, Kindle is a counselor, Kindle is an employee, Kindle is a sister, Kindle is a daughter, Kindle is a friend, etc. It's like someone could ask, how do you navigate all those different facets of your life? Well, everyone has different facets of their life. Mine just happens to also be across like being American, being Nigerian American, and not just being Nigerian. Being Igbo is very different than being Yoruba. Even how they greet each other, very different. So now I think about one of my earliest memories is, again, I'm Igbo, we're from the eastern part of Nigeria, but the biggest city in Nigeria is in the west, Lagos. So that's where I grew up. So that's another dynamic where it's like, where you grow up is not where you're from.
Mm,
So even though you are in this new place in Nigeria, people still hold on to the customs of where they're from. And again, the country is not like massive, it's smaller than the state of Texas for comparative. But I remember in kindergarten, they were teaching us how to greet people. And in Igbo culture, when you greet people, especially if they're older than you just greet them. But in Yoruba culture, what's the word in English? In Yoruba is dabale. English is like prostrate, like a curtsy, if that makes
okay.
sense. And I remember the teacher was telling us like, this is how you like curtsy. And there's one do for that men do, there's one women do. And I went home and mom was like, we don't do that. We're Igbo. Igbos don't do that.
Yes.
And it was just like, okay, so I want to listen to my mom and greet how she's telling me to, but I don't want to, I'm going to get in trouble with the teacher who's Yoruba, because we're in Lagos, is the Yoruba
Right.
part of the country. And if I don't like, it's called posture, but it's like a curtsy. If I don't curtsy, then I get in trouble. So it's like you learn how to navigate that at a really young age.
Yeah.
And then when you get to America, you then learn how to navigate the fact that yes, you are Black in America. And when the average person sees you, they just see another Black person, but
Right.
realizing that you and then African Americans are different. And then even when I meet Nigerian Americans, all they know of Nigeria is what they hear from their parents and what they see in media, not lived experience. So also realizing that some of these things you may talk about and no one see, they understand, but they may not understand everything. So it's just the same way people navigate being a brother, sister, father, mother, coach, et cetera, et cetera. It's just
Yeah.
at that, I guess, different level.
Yeah.
Can it be overwhelming?
It sounds like it.
Not necessarily. I look at it as like, if you ever know someone who's like really, really fluent in like 3, 4 languages,
Mhm.
and they can just switch back and forth. Like my dad's, RIP to him. My dad was fluent in 4 languages, and he could switch, and it didn't phase him. And I've even met some of our students speaking English, Chinese, Korean.
Yeah.
Doesn't, so it's just one of those things. We learn how to switch. Like if your mom called you and you got off the phone with your mom, and 30 seconds later your best friend called you, we make that switch. We don't think
Yeah.
much of it. Here and there you might cross your hairs, but for the most part you got it all sorted out. So I
Yeah.
think it's relatively the same approach.
So like what we call pragmatics or code switching just in a cultural context. Well, it is
Yeah.
cultural. It's cultural anyway.
Yeah.
And then living in such a global society, we literally have to do that on a daily basis, depending on the environments that we find ourselves in. I
Mhm.
find it difficult as a Black woman having to do that in some of these overwhelmingly white spaces that don't get it. But I can imagine it would probably be challenging too if you're a member in a certain type of Black culture, um, but not. I don't know. I guess just know your audience and
That's really what it is.
relate to the audience that you find yourself in relationship with at that moment.
But sometimes, to your point, it can be difficult because, like, okay, being Igbo, living in the Yoruba part of the country and having to understand those differences, there are differences,
Yeah.
but they're not as drastic as differences of a Black person having to live in a white world, or a Black person living in China, in an Asian environment. So I think that's just, yes, Igbo to Yoruba, Nigerian to American, there are those differences, but like, it's almost like we have a bit more in common still than a Black person to a white person, or Black person to a Chinese person, or whatever. So to your point, sometimes it is a bit like uncomfortable when we're in these spaces and it's like, here it goes again, the only Black person or whatever. And especially after being in America for so long, because I was in America for 16 years before I came to China, where it's just like, you're so much more aware of it because that's just what dominates that sphere.
Yeah.
It's just like, I remember I said this in a meeting with our principal. I don't want to put her name on blast. I've been in a bunch of meetings in the start of the school year, and it was like the 5th or 6th meeting, and you were in it. And then the meeting ended, and you left. We were talking about stuff, and I was like, "This is the first meeting I've been in. I wasn't the only Black person." You know, they're not comfortable with it, so they kind of chuckle, and it's just like, "Oh shit!" And it's like, "Yeah, we got to deal with this all the time."
All the
Are y'all
time.
even aware? Are y'all even aware that this happens? And I'm not telling you, you don't have to sit there and have pity on me. I'm not saying that, but it's just acknowledging that this is my reality every day. And I just find that dynamic interesting because a few times in my life, when I've tried to like bring white people to an environment when then they're the only white person, there's only 2, 3 of them, they're so uncomfortable with it. And I'm like, bro, that's literally my life. You know what I'm saying?
Every day. Can't escape it.
Since like pretty much since college, because the
Exactly.
town I moved to when we went back to the US, like at your point, it was like 30 Black, white, Hispanic.
Yeah.
And I went to school in Delaware. Shout out Joe Biden, fellow Blue Hen alumni. They'd be asking for money, but I'm not giving them no money. But going to Delaware, it's a very white school.
Yes.
And it's like every class you go to, when you're walking through the campus, it's just like, man, it's a lot of white people.
That's how UT
And
was.
that's kind of like I was saying this to one of my friends, it was kind of my ignorance is like, when I moved to the US, I go to a town that's like 30. So it's like all these white people are because they've all gone to school, like primary, elementary school, middle school, high school. So they're familiar being around Black and brown people. So ignorantly, in my head, I'm like, oh, this is how white people in America are. Then when I got to college, it was like, oh shit, most of y'all are not from a town like Hackensack. Most of y'all are like only white people. because I was like, I guess what I'm trying to say is like, I didn't really fully understand white people till I was about 18, even though I've been in America 6 years, because all those white people I knew, they've had Black and Spanish kids on their soccer teams, classrooms, etc. Then in college, these kids are clearly choosing their words when they're talking to me. It's kind of like, should I say Black? Should I say African American? I'm just like, you could just talk. Like, it's okay.
I mean, doing the mental math, I'd be like, oh, child, it's not that deep.
And you
Ooh,
can see them thinking about it. And
yes.
you know, they'll all remember your name because you're the only Black kid on the floor. And I don't remember their name. Billy, Todd, Bob. I'm like, I don't know. And they all know your name. And I'm just like, oh damn, what is his name again? Shit. And I just think like, what's wrong with me? Why can't I remember their names? And I was like, hold on, I'm the only Black person here. So of course they're gonna remember my name. Like, what's
Memorable,
going
right?
on?
Exactly.
Exactly. So
Yeah, I think these are good conversations, even for like our students to have, especially since being a part of a dominant culture in China, and most of them have no interest in staying in China and are gonna go to the United States or the UK, Australia. What's another big hub? Just
New
Europe.
Zealand gets Canada, is a big one as well.
Yeah, Canada. And they're gonna become
And
still a
other,
person of the global majority, but in that context,
other.
other, exactly. I don't like to use minority, but yeah, they're going to be other like all the time. And I don't know if we prepare them for, not definitively like this is what you're going to experience, because again, you're not going to be Black. So what you experience is going to be very different. But I don't know. What do you believe it looks like to prepare? We're both in education, and maybe not even just
Mhm.
Chinese students, but preparing this generation of kids for truly living in a global society. Like, what are some important things that you believe from your own experience that you think it would be vital for them to know?
I think it first and foremost depends on the kids you're talking to. So like in our case, we're talking to most kids who are of Chinese heritage. And a lot, like Kendall said, a lot of them have foreign passports because our school only takes foreign passport kids. But for the lack of a better word, they're all, a lot of them, not all of them, a lot of them are anchor babies. They left that country, Canada, US, 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, or whatever. So they don't really, their whole lived experience on memory is in China. And it's one of those things like you, for the first time, be in a country where most people don't look like you. And not only do they not look like you, the people who do look like you don't have the power. Because I think that's what's really important. Because like our white kids, even though they're living in a place where most people don't look like them, the people who look like you maintain the power. Like we work in China, all our admin are white. 95% of our teachers are white. So it's like the power structure at like an international school. And for unfortunately, the global power structure is white. Here we both are speaking a European language, wearing European attire in Asia. Like go figure. But
Right,
that's the reality of the world we live in. It's a
right.
European dominated perspective. So it's having these kids, one, understand that that's going to be different. So that one or two, three white kids in your class, imagine that times 20 all the time. You're going to find your little pockets of other people who look like you, other international school kids who came from China, whatever, whatever. But like we know, when you're like the minority in the campus, you can find your people, but it's juxtaposed against being that minority group around all these white people. And it's not saying like they're all bad. I'm not trying to like
No, we haven't said
crush
anything
them or whatever.
about anyone, but it's the reality.
Yeah. It's about having them understand that. And I think what really helps this generation now is because like the internet is so prevalent, they're great like documentaries or series that they can, even though it might just look like it's for entertainment purposes, but it's
Yeah.
like, no, you should actually watch it to get a better understanding of like, okay, this is what life will be like.
Right.
And one of the other things I find also really interesting for them is like, okay, like I said, how I kind of really had a better understanding of white people when I turned 18. You said you went to Tech UT and it was mostly white, but home wasn't that far away. For them, home is 7,000 miles away. They can't go home on an extended weekend, oh, because I miss my mom, or
I'm
I just want
hungry.
to be in familiar surroundings. Like they can't, it's not practical.
Yeah.
And that dynamic, I haven't experienced that because at least like I went back to Jersey, I went to school in Delaware, 2 hour drive. I could go home on the weekend or whatever. I don't know how they will cope with that.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting because one of my students, I taught her brother as well. He's at school in the US, and in China, he was fine, you know, got along with his friends and all of that. So I ran into her once in the hallways, and I was like, "Oh, how's your brother doing?" She was like, "Oh, he just stays in his room all the time." And I was like, "Really?" I
He's
was like,
depressed,
"Because
all kind of
like
stuff.
that's not his personality from what I remember." She's like, "Yeah, you know, he'll go to class and just stay in his dorm all the time." And it's just kind of like he's probably having a hard time. And lo and behold, and I don't know the state, so if anybody's from there, I'm not bashing your state. I'm just going based on what I see. He went to Michigan. And it's just like, there ain't a lot of Chinese people in Michigan, bro. So sometimes when we tell these kids, like, they just always want to, like, not always, they're so big on the school with the name.
Name brand,
It's
not
like, it's not, that's not always how it works. You go to Dartmouth, it's a very white school in a very white state. That's just the reality of it. And if you're not used to that, if you're not comfortable with that, I had a student who wanted to go to Penn State. She lived in Hong Kong and Beijing. I'm like, you live in these major, massive cities.
yes.
Penn State is in the boonies. It's literally in the middle of nowhere.
In
Are you
Pennsylvania.
ready for that? Exactly.
That's a whole lot.
Exactly. It's like, are you ready for that?
Yeah.
All this stuff you see in Beijing and Hong Kong, it's mountains, people with guns, chewing stuff, and you know. So I'm just
Oh.
like, be mindful of that. Oh, but I really like Penn State. How can you say that? Like, so it's just, you know what I'm saying? It's just things like that. I think they just need to be mindful of. Is making sure they pick a place where they're going to be comfortable, has good academics, and they're great schools in cities that are more open, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's just really important that they are aware. And I think using like some of these like documentaries or series on like Netflix and Hulu can help them. And I think another issue that they run into is that the structures of international schools at the foundation, they were built as schools for like American, British, which indirectly saying they're schools built to make white kids abroad be comfortable.
Exactly.
So these teachers and these admins and these counselors at these schools, not a lot of them, in my opinion, are very well equipped to speak to students who aren't white about what it's like to be in college, because their college experiences were very different. And most of the people who work at these international schools, born and raised in America, born and raised in the UK, born and raised in Canada, they didn't leave their home country till they were at least 25. And by then, you're pretty much a fully developed human being. You're going to try to tell this 18-year-old who isn't white what it's going to be like to go to that country and live. You just don't have the context.
It's so
And I think
incongruent.
that's a big missing piece. And to tie it into something else you were saying, sorry, not to be long-winded,
Okay.
about how you navigate these different identities. I remember in college that book, The Souls of Black Folk, and Du Bois spoke about
W.E.B.
double consciousness.
Yeah.
And he spoke about double consciousness. Yeah, he's talking to the premise of Black people. But when I've thought about, you know, that double consciousness, I forget the little line in the book, and I've reflected on it. That premise applies to everybody who isn't white. Because we all, whether you're Chinese, whether you're Indian, whether you're Black, we have to learn to navigate this very European world while not being Europeans ourselves. But then most of these admin and counselors and teachers at these schools, they're white. So they don't have this double consciousness. So how can you teach these kids how to navigate something that you literally never had to do? So I just think it's very, very interesting. And I would love, and I don't know how and when and where and the way to get it done, to do like research on international school students who aren't white and how the experiences are in college and beyond.
Yeah.
As
So no
opposed to,
more
because
like
you
a
only see at
conscious study.
schools, yeah, like we always see like, oh, you know, like our school say this kid graduated our school, whatever, 2010, graduated from this school, 2015, 14, working here. Okay, you find the one good story, but let's do a study of like 10,000 of them across the world to
Exactly.
see what is your experience like, and then use some of that data to then inform the upcoming international school kids, like,
Yeah.
this is the reality of what you're going to face,
Yeah.
you know.
I work with a lot of them. I work with a lot of college students and, some of the data states that, especially like coming from this hemisphere of the world and then going to these very, white centric places, they have a very difficult time, international students especially, but, we're in an Asian context of not assimilation, but acculturating and just adjusting. Like you shared how your student's sibling is sitting in his room all day. Yeah, I can only imagine the mental health struggles that he's experiencing. The levels of anxiety, the depression, just really feeling separate and othered because you're in a place that you weren't really well educated on the culture of the city that you're moving to. Because it's not just about school. You're not gonna be in school 24/7. The way that they are living now, study, 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 test, 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 don't go to sleep. That is not how it's going to be when you leave here. You actually have freedom and you actually have time to live a life and join community. And I don't know if we prepare our kids for the reality of that. I know I think about lots of things, but that's a whole nother conversation. But I just want to ask you, just thinking about choosing to go into education, what were some of the, and then education in an international context, what were some of the deciding factors for you to go this route?
Okay, so I'm gonna keep it brief this time, the best of my
I know you
ability.
too well.
So, like I said, my dad was stationed in the UN. My dad was a journalist. He was a national correspondent for the UN. And with him growing up in that realm, I was always drawn to like information and facts and things of that nature because of my dad was a journalist. And as we study in school, the subject that I saw had that stuff the most was social studies and history. And in high school, my favorite classes were my history classes, like grade 9, grade 10, grade 11. And I really loved like my social studies teachers. They were great, great personalities, great people. I learned a lot from them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I go to college. I initially majored in sports management because I wanted to become a sports agent. And then as I'm in the program and because like the head of the program is talking all this mess about, I didn't like his energy. Plus he was saying how like, you could graduate, go do an internship for like 2 years where you don't get paid and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, bro, I was like, I got student loans. I can't be doing all that.
I
And
ain't
my
got family
freshman
money
year,
that's coming in and in.
like
Oh,
in my freshman year in college, I just took a history course as one of those like kind of like an elective choice. And it was my favorite class. And I'm like, I've liked history all along. Here's another science, my favorite class. I like the teacher, a Black woman professor, actually. She just was great. I liked the class. So I decided to major in history. And I'm just like, okay. And I thought about like the impact my high school teachers had on me. And I was like, I want to have that kind of impact on students as well. So that's what it all started from my dad. And then that's what pushed me into being a history major, history education. I, graduated, got my teaching license, worked in the US. And then honestly, like the bureaucracy of public school teaching in America really like wore me down and just like, for the lack of a better word, sucked my soul a little bit, where it's like there's so many problems. There's certain ways to fix them, but to an extent you can't. And sometimes people always want to like bash administrators in schools in the US. And that's part of it, right? Administrators, sometimes they have these crazy demands of teachers and blah, 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 blah. At the same time, the other side that people don't want to focus on because you almost can't is like some of these parents are a hot mess. But it's one of those like if you have a business, you can't talk shit about your customers.
True.
And that's just, no one wants to say that, but that's the truth. Some of these kids come from horrible homes. And it's not necessarily like, oh, your dad's an alcoholic. That's not what I'm talking about. Because in these rich schools, the parents are alcoholics as well. So that's not. And the point is, you come from these environments where education is not prioritized. And to me, that was in my opinion, the biggest issue that I dealt with. It's like in these rich white towns or whatever, your mom could be a pill popper, dad could be an alcoholic, but they want you to go to school, graduate, get a degree, blah, 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 blah. In some of these other environments, they don't care. If you're
But do
running
you
the streets
believe
at
that
15,
100% to
16,
be true? I don't
a lot
necessarily
of times
believe
they just,
100% to be true.
no, in my experience, a lot of times it's just like, oh, well, if you go to school, as opposed to like in my house, going to school, and you said you have a lot of like Nigerian American friends in Texas.
Not optional.
You don't even have to have a conversation because that is just what is expected of you as a human being. And I felt for some of my kids, that just wasn't what was expected. And in some cases, the parents are overwhelmed. They're doing the best they can in these rough neighborhoods, et cetera, et cetera. But it's just like, you can only hold the parents accountable but so much.
Right.
And then I think because of that, the education structure is like built around trying to find ways to work around that. And then what do? Well, let's try to get more out of the teachers so that these kids can still be successful despite. And it's like, it takes everybody working together. Like there's just no, in my opinion, there's just no way around it. If teachers don't care, it's going to be a problem. If parents don't care, it's going to be a problem. If the city doesn't provide enough funding, it's going to be a problem, so on and so forth. So I think it's all tied together. And I'm not trying to say like, oh, people in the hood don't want their kids to be better, because that's not true. But it's one of those things like, again, like when your kid is 12 and the vocabulary is mostly profanity,
they learn this
somewhere. They're getting that from somewhere. You know what I'm saying? And to my knowledge, most teachers, not all, most teachers don't curse in class. So where are they getting that from? You get what I'm saying? It was just like, and you know, you hear these crazy stories. I had this kid when I taught 6th grade for 1 year, never do it again. No, 5th grade, I'll never do it again.
You don't like the baby?
Like, oh God.
Somebody else could deal with teachers middle school, like 7th grade. They some nuts, but I used to love teachers 7th grade. It was something every day.
But it was sad for me. And this is like my ignorance. Like, no, decided it was 6th graders. It's like 6th grade. I just assumed everybody could read because you're in 6th grade. I know, this is my ignorance. I just assumed everybody could read. And I was trying to get this kid to read. And I noticed every time, like, I'll kind of try to call on him, something will happen and a fight will start. And then eventually I tried to get him to read and he was stumbling over his words. And after like the 5th word in my head, I was like, oh shit, he can't read. But again, this is I'm just like, how can you not? So I spoke to the counselor. She's like, oh yeah, his dad is a truck driver. It's just growing up, the dad would just take him sometimes for 6 months on the road with him, like multiple times. And I was just like, who does that? Like, my brain still can't, like, who, like, what do you expect is going to come of your child? Like, who does that? But
I would say somebody not with limited options, but they still aren't helpful.
But the issue is he could stay with his mom. In this particular case, the kid could stay with his mom. The dad would go to the house and take him and be on the road for 6 months. And it's just like, oh man, what, like, is that every situation? No, that's just one example. But it's just like, all those things just led to frustration. And again, coming into America, it's like, I know, and I'm not knocking Americans, but I think sometimes they don't realize there's a whole nother world out there. True. People think the end all be all is America. And it's like, yes, America is like #1 economy, Hollywood, blah, blah, blah. But there's a whole other world of 7, 8, whatever, 7+ billion people out there. So I was just kind of like, this whole being in America teaching, if I do this for the next 20, 30 years, and I have some colleagues who are 20, 30 years, I'm just like, yeah, I don't want to be you when I'm 50, 60 years old.
Right.
Listen. Honest truth. You know, I'm just like, I don't want to be that. So I'm just like, again, like, let me see if I can get out of here. Because I think a lot of Americans just like, because, and it's not just Americans, it happens in a lot of other countries. I just think the difference is, at least America, y'all have tools and resources where if you want to venture out, it's a lot more feasible than people in other countries. But then they choose not to venture out. And it's just like, it's great. It's really great. It could be an amazing experience. So I was just like, let me look into other ways of going abroad. So I found this website. I put my resume out there. I was going to do like a ESL kind of job, like teaching English as a foreign language. And this dude saw my resume. He's like, "You're a licensed teacher?" I was like, "Yeah." He's like, "You should work at an international school." And I was kind of like, "What is that?" So
I'm
then,
training
it's a
center.
school.
No hate on
Yeah,
training.
it's not a training center. I was looking for training centers because that's what I thought I could get. He
Exactly.
was like, "No, no, no. Look at international schools." He's like, "I know a couple. I'll put you in contact with them." And I interviewed with one. And funny enough, I interviewed with one. The principal liked me. It was in China, but the owner was like, "He's black. No, get somebody else." True story.
Oh, I
And the
believe you.
guy,
I believe you. Know I
and
believe
the
you.
guy who was like my recruiter, he's from Chicago, but he moved to China. He's like Brazilian and Chinese, but he grew up in Chicago and then he moved to China. And he's like, kind of like, "You know how this shit goes." I was like, "No, trust me. I understand." He's like, "I'll find another school." So he found me another school. They were cool. They brought me over. And then I was there for a bit before I then went to the school that Kendall and I work in now. And honestly, that has been one of the best decisions of my life,
Yeah.
going abroad.
Yeah.
Don't regret it. We'll do it again, 1,000,000%.
I wish more people. So, like, one of the major impetus of me even doing this podcast and this show is to showcase that you can live a very more than comfortable, aligned life if you make the leap of going abroad. I noticed, part of what you said earlier was that, some people don't choose to, but it's difficult for us to make these choices if we're not exposed to the fact that the options are even out there. And then we know that we have gatekeepers like the racist that didn't want, the Black person at the school.
Mhm.
I keep wondering, what can the pipeline look like to get more of us? I would love for so many of my friends in education, like there's no way I would ever go back to work in education in the United States unless like I'm privately contracting. I had the worst burnout, some of the worst managers, some great people that have become members of my family, but there's more stress than there is fulfillment. And then you add in everything that's happening now with COVID and people trying to ban books and shit, and you got folks like Ron DeSantis. I don't even want to get into that conversation, or even Greg Abbott, where I'm from, a nut, really just trying to take over public education. Because once you dismantle that, you're going to have an uneducated workforce and then scrounging for, jobs that aren't going to provide them the level of life that they could have. But you got people doing the grunt work. And then I think that reinforces like the classist system that the United States definitely is. What do you think the pipeline could look like? We've done this for a few years. We'll continue to be abroad for a while. Like, what suggestions would you have if you were to talk to another Black man in the States, or students or kids or whatever, college kids, like what kind of message would you give them as far as looking for work outside of your immediate sphere? What would that look like?
So I've always thought about this, and three things. One, and again, it's almost unfair because I'm speaking with the benefit of hindsight. I'm not speaking as someone who's like 2021.
Right.
One, if you know you want to be in education, and if you have the means, go to University of Northern Iowa, because
They recruit heavily there.
they have a pipeline built in for international teaching.
Yeah.
One of our colleagues was in my former department, our current colleague, I don't put people's names on blast out here like that. That's where she went to school. She did her student teaching internationally, got licensed. So she's literally never taught in the US, even student teaching, through University of Northern Iowa. So they create a pipeline for that. They actually have a recruitment fair where if you are a student there in the education program, whether it's bachelor's or master's, they set you up. We have schools from all over the world come and try to talk to you.
Wow.
So that's one. If you are that's if you know you want to do education.
Right.
I didn't really know till like my second year in college. So I understand.
Yeah, my second.
You know what I'm saying? Like, yeah. So I understand that. So that's, I guess, for those people who know from like the jump, like that's what I want to do. Yeah. Cool. If you figure it out, like while you're in college, kind of like how we did or whatever, graduate, get your license, teach for 3, I'd say between 2 to 4 years or 5, and then go abroad. And even though they're racist, one thing with these white people is they be feeling guilty. So you got to use the guilt against them. Search Associates, International School Services, Teacher
Scroll.
Horizons, Scroll. These are companies that recruit for international teaching. And another thing was when I did my master's, I did my master's in school leadership, but it was through a global programs at the College of New Jersey. Shout out TCNJ, great program. The director, I can say his name because I know he won't care. Stuart Carroll is amazing. He's a little nutty, but he's an amazing human being.
Do they have online
Great person to be around. They have online options. Before COVID, you would go and do it in the summer, which was great because you do all your coursework in the summer. So when you are working, because I feel like a lot of master's programs for teachers, you do it in the evening and it's like, bro, I got grading to do, lesson planning. So it's exhausting. TCNJ is in the summer, and they had satellite campuses in Spain, Portugal, South Africa for a little bit, Egypt, Taiwan, Thailand, and Turkey.
Wow.
But that's all pre-COVID. COVID's kind of screwed things up. So they still have Portugal for sure in person. And I think they have a couple more online. Just Google TCNJ Global Programs and it'll pop up. That is one option. So if you use all those search engines, Search Associates, et cetera, you can get your way out. If it's like you've been in a career for a couple of years and you're like, I'm not feeling this anymore, and you're looking for something relatively quickly, the Teacher Ready program out of Florida, you can get a teaching license in about 10 months, I want to say, 10 to 12 months. That's through Florida if you want like an American teaching license. If you want a British route, and the good thing, and a lot of Americans like, I'm not doing no British shit, the way a lot of British people are like, I'm not doing no American shit. But the British teaching licenses don't have to be renewed. You get it once, you're done.
Really?
Yeah, a PGCE, they don't have to keep it up.
It's in perpetuity as long as you stay in a career.
University of Sunderland has an online program, and University of Nottingham. It's called PGCEI for international education. Both of them, like the Teacher Ready Florida program, take about a year, all online. And it's one of those, it's internationally recognized, because you got to watch out for some of these schools that'll give you a certificate and nobody actually looks at it. So those are the different paths. And one thing I've been trying to think of some way to do, and I don't know, maybe Ken and I can talk later or whatever, is try to find a way to be like a company that goes to college campuses, to education majors, and just introduces them to teaching abroad. Because it's something I wish someone would have told me when I was 18, 19. I just literally had no idea it existed. But it's like, when you think about it, every country has embassies. So they have diplomats, and the kids got to go to school. So the international schools literally in every single country in this world, like literally speaking. And being the DP coordinator, I get the IB's report. There are 87,000 children around the world in the IB program.
Oh my God.
I was like, God damn. I was like, God, no, sorry, I misspoke. There are 87,000 in America in the IB program. Globally, it's about 200,000.
Oh, wow.
So it's just, but again, think about how many countries got diplomats, their kids go to school, and then what's happening in the last 10, 15 years is international, like rich people, wealthy locals are sending their kids to international schools at an increasingly alarming rate. This is everywhere in the world. It's not just in China or like Saudi Arabia or whatever. So point being is there are going to be just more and more and more and more and more international schools coming about. There's just no, it's like a storm that's coming. There's nothing people can do about it. So the point being is there are more opportunities. And in my opinion, as there are more opportunities coming from that realm, in my opinion, American schools just keep going in the fucking toilet.
They are. And
Make that jump. Less stress, more money, more freedom to do what you want and how you want in the classroom. Great travel opportunities. You meet people from all over the world. It truly does. It sounds all corny and cliche. It does give you a more global perspective or whatever. It's not meeting people that only talk about shit going on in your town or in your county or in your state. It's on an international level. And we live in such a highly globalized world. That's where the world is headed. So, you know, it's so funny. Like, I know some of your viewers, as I'm saying these names, Wizkid, Davido, they're like, oh yeah, I know these people. 15 years ago, you wouldn't have known these people. Now they're global, like, icons of music, which is
Yeah.
crazy. But why? The internet. We live in
Yeah.
a globalized world, so it's changing things. So that's the direction we're heading in.
It is. It makes me so nervous for like public school in the US though. It's being
It's a sinking
dismantled
ship.
on
It's
purpose.
unfortunately, it's a sinking ship.
I don't want to lean into that, but I feel
One of
I
my
feel
colleagues
it.
in the US said this, and he's a white dude. He was like, public education in America is one of the last entities that is yet to be privatized. I was like,
They
facts.
trying their hardest. They trying their hardest.
And what? And once he said that, and he's just his thing is just like, think about how much money people, businesses, organizations would make when education is wholeheartedly privatized across the US.
Yeah, charter schools
And when he
make it.
said that, I was just like, you know what I'm saying? And once he said that, I was just like, you know what? You're right. It's only a matter of time. And they're gonna,
I'm
you're gonna see
hoping
all
it
this back
never
and
happens.
forth.
I'm hoping it never happens. I'm hoping that people wake
All
up
I'm
and
saying is,
recognize.
for example, the United States Postal Service was federalized, right? And that shit was going downhill until Amazon came in. Amazon is a private company. Privatization, people make a shit ton of money, and that's just where it goes. In the US, there's no national phone service. It's all privatized. So some of these different entities of life to just keep getting privatized. Education is like one of the last big ones in America. And they're going to fight tooth and nail to privatize it.
They are. Like, I was listening to something
Yeah.
the other day that talks about just the kind of money that charter schools make in the way, and they can turn away kids. Like public education, you have to accept everybody, as we should. I just need people like to wake up. Like if we're going, and we're not talking about politics or anything, but hell, everything's political. Like the politics that matters the most is your mayor, your governor, your school board, those kinds of things. They're making, just in Texas alone, so many changes. I think recently the governor of my state was like, they no longer are required to teach about like Native Americans and MLK. And I'm just like, what?
But that's just what it is. My friend said it brilliantly. He said, America is experiencing a cold civil war.
Oh, for sure.
That's just what's happening.
For
That's
sure.
just what's happening.
And
We're at war in the country. There's just no bloodshed.
Can't even say it's cold when you got people being gunned down, every day in a Walmart, or God rest his soul, a Tyree situation. So it's hot for some folks. For sure.
It is.
So
it's
a lot.
Different ideological differences are just coming to a head. Yeah. And sadly, it's not going away anytime soon. I'm not saying it's always going to be this way, but not in the near future.
Yeah, sometimes I feel like it's going to get a little bit more cataclysmic before it begins to make some sense.
Yeah.
So I want to shift this conversation. We talk about mental health. I want to talk about that for a while. As a Nigerian man who's lived in America, when you think of mental health and what that means, individually, culturally, like what have been some messages passed down to you? Like, what have been some of the side conversations that you've heard when it comes to people in your community, in your, circles of influence, discussing mental health, mental illness, or not?
I think it is varied. Like the classic one people would say was like, oh, it wasn't discussed in my like environment or whatever. And I push back when people say that. I think every group discusses it. They may just not use certain vocabulary that now the gatekeepers of mental health use. So you see it as something different. I'm not talking. And I think that's just what it is, because like certain things to me are part of the human experience. And it don't matter where you're from or what you look like. For example, every culture has food.
Yeah.
Can't be like, oh, we didn't talk about food in my culture because we didn't call it rice.
Right. Yeah.
Like, okay. there's another word for it in you, whatever. So I think it's been discussed. And I think from a Nigerian perspective, mental health isn't looked at the same way it is in the US. And I think in the US, there's a lot of like, this is where I told Kendall before this conversation that after this conversation, she'll stop talking to me. So it's been nice knowing you. You know what I'm saying? It's cool or whatever. But I think in the US, a lot of things get labeled in a way. And when you label it, you like feel like the label creates the stigma.
Okay.
And I think sometimes and I get it because you have to label something to identify so that you can solve the problem. I get that. At the same time, sometimes I think it's counterproductive because then it becomes like that thing over there. And it's just like, there are people who have mental health issues in Nigeria and they'll say like, oh, it's just like the crazy people. There's an expression, your head no correct, which means like your head is something in your head isn't correct.
Yeah.
That could be a way of saying the person may be dealing with some kind of mental health issue. And okay, we may not have the quote unquote sophisticated vocabulary, but it's just like, okay, we know something is wrong with that person, or like there's that village drunk, or whatever the case may be. So you've always kind of heard and seen these things. At the same time, it's like, well, what is the cause of it? Because I think sometimes like, and I think, okay, like in Nigeria, they assume like, unless something crazy happened to you, you shouldn't have these like mental health issues, right?
There's no reason for you struggling like this.
And I think sometimes what they would do was they'd look at the extreme cases where like in a lot of these different towns, you see the similar. It's kind of like in the US, like Nigeria and the different like smaller towns, there's always one person is like always like the drunk person or a handful of people. And in America, they say, oh, he's dealing with substance abuse. In Nigeria, they're like, he's just a drunk. Like, he just loves to drink or whatever. And he's drunk or she's drunk all the time or whatever the case may be. So I think they do see it that way. And it's like you are labeled, but it's one of those like, and how do I say it? It's almost like, okay, this person handle that person with care because all is not well with that person. And there's that approach to it. Is it all super sophisticated going off like the DSM and things of that nature? No, but it's still like handle that person with care. And from a communal perspective, there'll be people who look out for this one person or those people, whether it's making sure they have food or they have clothes or they have a place to stay. And when some big boss comes around, you collect some money so that you can help this person out. So those sorts of things do happen. But in terms of those, like the way these conversations happen in the US, they don't happen like that. Because like in the US, you see like, talk to your kids about mental health or talk to your kids about drug use. They don't have those conversations in Nigeria, at least in my experience. It's just like, you know not to do it, don't do drugs. I don't got to tell you, you know not to do it.
Right. Do you think it would be helpful to have these preemptive conversations? Again, as the world is getting more global.
Yeah, honestly, like, how do I say this? In theory, yes, it would be helpful. In practice, I think not. And the reason why I say that is, let me try to get the thoughts in my head right. When you tell a kid, especially someone between the age of like 12 and 17, who's already from a strictly biological perspective, and I'm literally building my lessons for tomorrow, looking at this like development of the brain, they're already irrational people. And that's just part of where they are in life. At least that's what the science says. If you start telling me, I'm going to have a conversation with you, don't do drugs, don't drink alcohol, don't go hang with these bad kids, I'm going to be curious to at least try to entertain what that is.
That's so mischievous.
The good thing about that conversation is that when I do go entertain that, you've planted some seeds of what I should do or not do. So that will be the good part of it. But then the flip side is sometimes you create that curiosity for me when I may not have wanted to go in that direction. And part of what I'm trying to get at, one of the examples that I guess I can explain in context is this. In America, it's very, very clear as a child, like, you don't touch alcohol, don't touch drugs, blah, 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 blah. It's very clear, like that's the message. But how many Americans could honestly say they did not smoke weed before the age of 18?
Before
So
eight.
I just got before 18. How many could honestly, people say, well, I didn't, I've actually never smoked weed. That is true. But how many people could say that before the age of 18? So it's like, are those conversations effective? Because people just end up doing it. Whereas in a country like Nigeria, we don't have those conversations. It doesn't mean some teenagers don't do it, but they don't do it nearly at the same rate because they don't kind of like throw this all in your face of don't do this, don't do this, do this way, do this way. Sometimes let people, there's something of value of learning through trial and error. And I think sometimes in the US, they try to build too many things in place when it's just like, no, let my brain figure it out on its own. We're not that dumb. You don't have to pre-program everything for us. It doesn't mean there's no good to it, because when those things do happen, people need to know, like, okay, what's going on? Like, okay, if you're drinking and you feel the room is spinning, it means you've drank too much, you need to chill. If I didn't know that, I just might just, oh, who knows? And maybe you drink too much alcohol poisoning or whatever. So long story short, I see the benefit of doing it or not doing it, but to say like it would have been more beneficial if I, in my case, had those conversations before, I don't think so. I think it would have made me more likely to do those things. Because I remember, never forget, when I first got to college, I had all white roommates. They
Everybody.
knew so much about alcohol than I did. And I was just kind of like, how long have y'all been drinking alcohol? Oh, since I was 14, 15. Then you talk to my British buddies here since I was 12, 13. And I'm just like, God damn. But again, in these countries, you have all these things in place to help kids. And I'm like, clearly this shit ain't helping. They've been drinking and smoking. Like, it's just normal.
I would want to do a longitudinal study to see who among them have alcohol abuse issues. Because there is science that states the earlier you are with your brain development, that you engage in frequent inebriation, that increases your propensity of being an adult that struggles with alcohol abuse. So I hear, and to a degree, agree with some of the things that you're saying. I think when it comes to certain topics, let's just like talk about suicide or whatever. The research does state if people are experiencing suicidal ideation, difficulties with mental health, having those conversations, don't implant. That's like one of the suicide myths, is if I talk about it, then they're gonna want to go do it. That's not the case. I don't know. Like, I don't know what the middle ground would be. There is something that you did say earlier when it comes to this about the communal aspect of healing. And those are that particular type of structure is definitely more of what I want to lean into, like in my practice. And I know that a lot of non-white clinicians are definitely looking like the ecological system of healing. What does your community support look like? Because we don't heal in isolation. And a lot of that is adopted from more non-white countries, looking at healing through music, healing through movement, healing through community, change the food you're eating. Just a lot of things that aren't westernized. So I agree with a lot of what you're saying. Let me ask you this. How do you care for your mental health as a man?
Well, that's one of those things is, one, I don't approach it like that.
Okay.
I just approach it. And I think sometimes that's where things get awry. I don't approach it in that context. It's one of those things like, as a person, whoever you are, what are things that make you feel good? And you need to make the time and effort to do those things or be around those people. And personally, and I know Kendall, and I know what you do and how you get down. If most people just focused on it that way, all these quote unquote mental health issues, I'm not saying they don't happen or they wouldn't happen.
Right.
It wouldn't be so big. It's like, if you enjoy conversations, for example, even though they're not doing too good right now, I'm a Laker fan. And I enjoy basketball. So I frequently have conversations with my friends about basketball. And I don't say, oh, I'm going to have a conversation with my friends about basketball to maintain my mental health. No, I just have these conversations. LeBron's about to break the record, the scoring record and all of that. And things like that, inadvertently or not like directly intended, they'll lift my spirits. I have a
Yeah.
conversation with my brother about like finances, that'll lift my spirits. So it's just like doing things with people you care about, or doing things you care about will help you feel good. And I think what starts to happen in this modern world we live in, and I sound like an old person. I'm 35, I'm not like 50. But we have too many relationships on these devices.
Yes, I
And
agree.
they're not natural, they're not pure. One day we may get there where these things substitute for human connection, but we're not there yet. We're not, but the problem is we haven't evolved to that state yet. We're not there yet. So until we get there, you know, people have like, oh, friend, but it's not really your friend. You do this thing, but you don't really like it. You just do it because it's like it's popular. Like that's how you screw yourself up, and then start having these issues. So it's sometimes it's just like, no, just do you, be you. If you do things or you like things that people around you kind of think like you're weird or whatever, find people who have those shared interests, be around them, you'll be good. So I guess to answer your question specifically, the people that matter to me the most, I stay in close contact with them. And things that matter to me, I stay around it. Like I'm very big on like politics and political theory, like literally like clockwork. And this is what makes me like an old person. When I read the news, because nowadays you can't just read one thing. I read CNN, I read BBC, I read Al Jazeera, like almost every single day. So because at the end of the day, CNN and BBC, they got like Western hype in them. And a lot of people don't realize that. I read Al Jazeera to get the news from a different perspective.
Yeah.
And that helps me feel like I'm well informed, or I'm have balance in my perspectives that are coming to me. I talk to my siblings, I talk to my friends, I go on sometimes, you know, things you see on social media, and I don't use social media that much. I'm old, I only use Facebook. I don't really do Instagram and Twitter. I know people are like, are you like 90? I'm like, I might as well be, but whatever. So I see certain things out there and then I'll investigate it. I love to watch, like, being a history major, I'm also a psychology teacher, but being a history major, I love watching like historical movies and TV shows. And then I'll read it, I'll watch it, then I go read about it. Things like that make me feel good. Spending time with my son when he's not driving me crazy, which is so crazy. 5-second tantrum. He's great. Midnight to 6 a.m., he don't want to sleep. And I'm just like, bro, what you doing? So
Let's
outside of
party.
those 6 hours, outside of those 6 hours, you know, just, and that's what it is. Sports helps. Exercise is a big thing. I think gets underlooked. A lot of times people's mental health is off because we're physically off.
True.
And in the more technologically advanced world we are, like you and I here having a conversation, sitting on our ass for the last hour and a half. If we were having this conversation while walking, that helps a bit more. So people also have to make it a point to do things to be active. Yeah. So those little things will help people's mental health.
I agree. I want to do the whole walking interview. This weather got to get it together.
I know it's freezing right now.
Right. And I got to figure out like what the technology for that looks like. Because what you're saying are things that are all true. You're saying stay connected to community, exercise, you know, watch what you're intaking, be that physically or through media, and staying informed, like challenging your brain, reading, learning new things. All of those things are hallmarks of wellness. So seems as if we're on the same page more than you like to agree. And I appreciate it. I just have, you know, one more question. I really want you to share, you know, on this 35-year journey that you've been on and all of the experiences that you've had and the learning that you've acquired and the relationships that you're a part of. What are you most proud of?
That's this is one of those questions. That's a great question.
Thank
and
you.
I think it's this sounds really odd what I'm about to say. It's one of those like, because life is not over, it's a bit, I mean, who knows, God forbid, I may drop dead next week or something. But
God, don't do that.
yeah. But it's one of those like, well, things are not over yet. So it's tough to say. However, looking at it, if I had to reflect right now, I mean, I guess I could point to a few things. Again, I think one of the best decisions I made was leaving the US. So y'all watching this in America, just give it a try.
Even if it's 3 or 6 months, trust me.
Exactly. Just
You'll love
give it a
it.
try. And keep in mind, like, we are in China. I didn't go to like Europe or something. We're in
Portugal, I'm
China.
going next.
Portugal looks dope. Sometimes the salaries for teachers don't be looking so hot.
Yeah, I ain't
But
even trying to be in
Portugal
no
looks dope.
education system though. So I ain't even, I'm good.
Oh, see, I can that's for lack of a better, that's where I'm at right now. But like going abroad is one of the things I'm most proud of for myself because it truly, because I feel like I already had a bit of a different kind of a global perspective because of coming from Nigeria and the US and all of that. It just further deepened that. That's one. And even though sometimes China gets on my nerves, Beijing is a fascinating city. Like it really is. Like I can't, like I'm trying to be objective. I can't take that away from Beijing or whatever. Just because you meet, even though it's hella Chinese people, there are so many expats from all over the world.
Yeah.
It truly is a cool city. I got to give it credit for that. I'm very proud of that. I would like to think I've made my parents proud, which is, if that is true, I'm proud of that because I'm nothing without my parents. I'm nothing without my family. So if they're proud of me, then I'm proud that I've made them proud. I'm happy about that. This, I want to not articulate this right. I'm very proud of being a father. At the same time, like so many people are parents. So I'm like,
don't invalidate don't invalidate your experience.
You get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm proud of that. And I'm proud of where I am in my career, I could say as well. Again, I'm the only Black male in the high school, not the whole school, in the high school. As the DP coordinator, I joke I'm fake admin. I'm in the office. I don't get the pay scale, and I don't get all decision making, but I get. But I don't think our school has had any Black admin. So if I'm considered admin, I'm proud of that. And I'm very proud of the opportunities I've given myself in terms of travel and being exposed to different things. Like I've been on every continent except Australia and Antarctica. I wanted to go there when I turned 40 till I saw them prices. And I was like, yeah, maybe 60.
Global prices, they got to come down.
Yeah. And I mean, again, it hasn't happened yet, but I'm projecting that I think I'll be proud of the experiences I give my son and my child to be as well. I think I'll be very proud of those experiences for them. And obviously everybody has work to do. I need to exercise more, stop eating so much. I don't eat crap, but I just love food. So making healthier diet choices or whatever. But I think those would be things I can say I'm proud of.
So what would be your last words? Well, you don't do social media.
I mean, I got Facebook. People want to look me up that way.
Share your Facebook. You can join my community on Facebook. What's your Facebook?
This is my name, Jeffrey Idigo. I don't have a page. Is it a page? Again, I got Facebook when it first came out. So to me, that's how it's supposed to be. So all this new shit on Facebook, I'm like, I don't like.
I need you to give.
I know I sound so old. Trust me, I know. My friends tease me about it all the time. That's just, I'm an old soul. But Jeffrey Idigo is my name. Find me on Facebook. If people want to reach out, one thing I do like to do is I've been on like 2-3 panels where they were looking at being a black teacher abroad. And I love answering questions about that because in a perfect world, I could create some kind of like organization that literally recruits Black teachers from all over the world and says to these international schools, here are these qualified people, they check all these boxes you want. They don't check the skin color box you want, but you don't say you want. But here these people go, and not just from the US, the UK, I got a couple of Kenyan colleagues and things like that. So from all over the world, here we are. you say you're international school and this whole nonsense they put in the mission statements only in words, not in practice. Here you go. So I love answering questions about stuff like that. As y'all can see, I talk a lot, so I don't mind answering questions. I know I talk.
He
I get it
does
from my
have a
dad in
very
my defense.
detailed perspective, but so do
He
I.
used to he used to talk a lot, so I get it from my dad as well. And I would love to do something like that because I
Yeah.
think that would be, again, especially with the bureaucracy of education in the US. If you told someone, and I remember I had a coworker, he used to say, "I'm not qualified to make as much money doing anything else but this."
Yeah,
I
we
remember he
literally
used to say that.
can do anything, anything.
In my head, I'm like, again, this is when I was in the US, so I didn't know. When I finally went abroad, I remember I met up with him. I was like, you realize with your experience, you got 2 master's degrees, just whatever it was, X amount of expensive teaching. If you go abroad, you would have fewer students, more control over what you taught, with more money.
And travel.
And of course, it's like, yeah, but I'm not sure. And I'm just like, hey,
It's there.
you've complained about something. Here's a potential path out. It's up to you if you want to take it or not. And again, it's not for everybody, right? I understand
Right.
some miss their
Right.
family, miss their friends, miss the environment. Like I don't speak Chinese. Kendall doesn't speak Chinese. So sometimes navigating. Again, I talk about the phone, but without this phone, we're dead. Like if you
Like
can't
cannot
translate,
exist in Beijing, in
you
China.
cannot exist
Cannot
without your
exist.
phone.
Yeah.
Exactly. So I understand some of those struggles. However, you don't have to go to China. You can go to countries where they speak English, and it's just, or if you already know Spanish, you go to a country where they speak Spanish, whatever.
Yeah.
I would love to find a way to get more people like us into this realm because I think international education is one of the best kept secrets, and white people keeping that secret to themselves. And it's like, nah, bro,
Facts on facts.
share with everybody else.
Facts.
So,
But like you told me before, people in power ain't trying to give up their power to folks to make it more equitable.
they're definitely not.
So,
They're definitely not.
power doesn't conceive without a demand. Who is that? Frederick Douglass. It is Black History
Mm-hmm.
Month. So, so share with us one of the quotes that you had that you wanted to share.
See, that's why I know I filled that thing out. Because I remember I filled out the quote, but now I don't 100% remember the quote I put.
Okay.
I think, give me a second. Oh, no, I remember it now. My quote was, "It is what it is." That was my
That
quote.
sounds like you.
And the reason why I put that is that sometimes we wish and hope and pray and whatever, but it is what it is. It doesn't mean you can't change it, but you have to accept that's the starting point.
Yeah.
I wish and sometimes pray I have a six-pack, but I don't because I don't exercise enough to get one. It is what it is.
True. I hear you.
So
listen, I have thoroughly enjoyed. I mean, I talk to you all the time, so I've thoroughly enjoyed talking to you in this formal format. And you've offered so many things that our audience can glean from. And you've really just sparked my interest on what does it look like to create something for people like us, other people like us, to get us into more countries. So I hope that wasn't just something you were saying, because
no,
now
I've
I'm
been
really
thinking about it.
doing that.
I've been thinking about it. I don't know how to get it off the ground, but that's something I would love to do more of.
Yeah.
Because some of these stories you hear, like, so for those who don't know, like when George Floyd happened, it was horrible and all of that. A lot of these in America, you saw with these companies, international schools, all this like guilt. Oh, we're sorry, we have to do better, be better. And then that narrative of like, oh, we don't find qualified Black and brown people.
Okay.
I've heard that several times. So it's like, okay, if I start a company, here's 400 of them. Now what's your excuse? Because they always got a reason as to why in my 4 years at our current school, I've been the only Black male teacher. And for 2 of those 4 years, I've been the only Black staff member in the high school. Okay, here's some people. So I'm not just talking. I'm dead serious about it. I just don't know how to get it off the ground.
Okay. Well, whatever help you need, I'm willing to collaborate with you on that, because the opportunity is out there for us. And I know a lot of us have to kind of be untethered from that. Well, I'm gonna miss my family, and baby, trust me, you can go home in the summer. You can go home for
These
Christmas.
help.
Got phone. We
And
check
these
in the
help.
phone.
WhatsApp, they
You
help.
ain't gonna miss your family when you getting them checks every month, and you can pay off bills and buy property and travel the world and not have the stress. Not saying that you're not going to have stress, because you will have stress. There's a different type of stress being in these environments, but you just have such a greater opportunity to live a different type of life that we don't see in our everyday lives back in the States. So yeah, it is what it is, and I would definitely like to partner and see what that can look like. So I appreciate you sharing your story with us today, Jeff. And for everyone that's watching, I want to say thank you again for tuning into the Black Expat Experience. I encourage you to keep taking risks, impacting your communities, and prioritizing your mental health, like always. And please follow us on our podcast formats: Apple, Stitcher, Spotify, and Google. And, do us a solid and share this in your communities of influence. And with that, I'm going to say thank you and bye. Happy Black History Month.
Bye-bye. Thank you for having me.
Of course.